the way in which gendered practices lead to relationships often of great inequality, particularly in relation to access to economic and political power, has been one of my overriding themes and concerns. But I had not actually spent much time thinking about the post-conflict so much as conflict. I've written on the Zimbabwean liberation struggle and masculinity, and then this is a quote. I was basically challenged by two authors who are setting up a book on women and post-conflict transformation to see how did I think, what did I think needed to be added to thinking about post-conflict transformation. And one of the things that I began to realize was that at that time I was just thinking of a few cases that I knew about, that so often there's hope and all these promises during conflict, and then after the conflict is over, it seems like over and over we go back to either what was there before in terms of gender relations and inequalities, or even worse. And so then when I came across Sandra Hale's quote, which is in this wonderful book called The Aftermath, which is one of the coming out of South Africa in particular, and she points out that when you look at Russia, China, Algeria, Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, the Palestinian Intifada, and she's saying no liberation or revolutionary war has empowered women and men to maintain an emancipating atmosphere for women after the military struggle, and I think it's important, brief honeymoon, because there often is a brief honeymoon where everyone thinks, oh wow, this is going to be wonderful. So I started thinking we need to investigate this. We've got to ask more serious questions about how this happens. And we have to know where the solutions have been sought already. The UN Resolution 1325 argues that we need more women in the peacemaking process. And there has been some movement. Liberia is an example of that, where there were a lot more women involved in peacemaking. But it's important to remember that during that very process, there was a tremendous spike in gender-based violence, both during and all through the rule, even with a president who's a very accomplished woman. Liberia has an excessively high level of sexual violence, gender-based violence. So this, and Laura Shepard's work is wonderful for pointing out that this is an important first step, but it is not enough. It's not enough. Even when women are there, it's not changing things enough. Then there's also been a focus on, well, how can we make the peace process work better? So we set up the DDR, Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration as a framework for post-conflict resolution, moving from conflict to peace. Legal and bureaucratic structures which are supposed to help put gender equality in place. And the gendered practices of foreign peacekeepers and international agencies have also been a concern of many feminists who've done feminist, male and female feminists, who have done important work demonstrating that a lot of the foreign peacekeepers and international agencies have brought their own sense of gender inequality to the peace process, even not consciously, and have hampered change. But the internal factors, the factors that work on the ground, in conflict zones, has been much less examined. It has and that is where I'm arguing we need to put a lot more focus. Because if everything is external, if we need more women in international peace processes, we need international peacekeeping, then that lets off the question of gender relations on the ground disappear. And I'm arguing that they are actually critical for the way post-conflict transformation occurs. Now, the gender analysis, I don't have to speak to the knowledgeable crowd that you are, but gender does not equal sex, and gender relations and hierarchies are, I think, at the pivot. So it's not enough to focus only on women. You have to focus on masculinities, femininities, which can be experienced by women and men, not all. Some men see themselves as feminine, not very many, and a lot of women see themselves as at least partially masculine or following certain masculine practices. The question of alternative gendered practices, the kind of practices that happen during crises, do they have any traction? What are they like, and what do they do? And how do they influence the way peace is imagined? And this is one of the things that I'm really trying to think about. What I'm arguing is that, and I'm really thinking about the example of North America. I don't know if any of you know the story Rosie the Riveter. I'm sure you all do, and everything. That actually during World War II, women in Canada and the US went into the factories, took up jobs. The state paid, the United States paid for babysitting, baby care. It was government supported for care. And during that time, a lot of women started to imagine themselves as being able to maybe have a job and have a family. So that there was this sense of imagining, but there was also a counter discourse of, after the war is over, we will go back to normal. Normal was the man with the job, the woman with the babies, and the nice house, and the little picket fence, and everything all settled. And so it's very interesting that at the end of World War II, both Canada and the US, one of the first things that they did was end childcare. Put the GI Bill for the soldiers to go back to school, and did everything, and all kinds of magazines. If any of you have read Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which was a life changer for me. When I read it, I was just going like this. I didn't put it down for 2 days. And but that is the kind of thing that makes us concerned, that even if you start imagining that life might be better, when you're allowed to do things that normally you're not allowed to do, and you start to imagine a possible different future, there are other people who are having other images of what the post-conflict world will be like. But what I'm arguing is that the imagined nature of the post-conflict that happens during conflict, during the period of conflict, is an important thing we need to study. And it's very gendered. Now, as Sandra Hale pointed out, there were a lot of promises in a lot of these conflicts. For instance, the Zimbabwean nationalist struggle, which is one of, and I should tell you, I'm focusing on sort of the liberation wars and the post-Cold War conflicts. So that's what I'm looking at in this paper, and I am looking primarily in Africa, which is my area of expertise, and also some examples from Latin America. So I'm not talking about Asia, where there are actually many, many interesting examples, but you can't do everything. But the point is, in a lot of these struggles, there was a publicity wing in most of the nationalist movements that actually were full-time sending out pictures, making newspapers, trying to convince everyone of their commitment and promising their commitment for a more gender equitable post-conflict transformation. Partly because a lot of these wars started in the 60s and on, when the women's movement was gaining traction. They wanted to attract support. These movements looked for support in Europe and North America. If they said they were going to keep the women in the back room, they were not going to get any support. So some of this was a tactic but there was a lot of publicity. There were pictures of women in conflict. But I think that it's also interesting that when you look at some of the pictures. They were about women maybe going into battle, but always with a baby on their back. You know, there was always a way, or women standing with a uniform and a gun, but with a baby on her back. It's like the double day sort of there, you know, over and over in picture after picture. And the other thing that I think is very important is to look at the way in which framing change, whether are things seen that changed during the war. This is something that Cynthia Enlow pointed out to me. She said the word for the duration of the war, that there was all through the war, a lot of the literature that came out was always about, well, for the duration. This is what we're going through. The duration suggesting that anything that happened during conflict was up for grabs in terms of whether it made an impact on life post-conflict. And so I think that's a very important point. The thing that's very interesting, like particularly I've drawn a lot on the Zimbabwean model, is that the gender division of labor in the military has often remained fairly traditional in terms of you find women being put into care work. In Zimbabwe, the women were in charge of finding food, cooking, cleaning, transporting. Then the educated women get in the health sector. They're nurses. They're in charge of these publicity. They do education. So there is quite a lot. I would say like 2/3 to all the way up to practically 90% of the women who go into these militaries, and these militaries, many of them are not formal. They're military groups, but they're not state armies. They are liberation armies. But so that it's very interesting in the Zimbabwe case, which is the one I know best, that probably the vast majority of women, whether educated or not, wound up in relatively gendered, classically gendered jobs. So that there is less change. When women go off to the military, it doesn't automatically mean that they're going to be carrying rifles. Many of these women never carried guns and were not assigned guns. They were not, in fact, seen as soldiers. They were seen as carriers and helpers, but they were not seen as soldiers. And this will have an impact later on at the post-conflict period. Some women got into combat. Many of them got new skills. They certainly had opportunities. Some of them dreamed of a future where they could take these skills and use them, or maybe they would move up in the military hierarchy or get a job. So there were some women who had more opportunity to engage in combat and so push the gender hierarchies a little bit in their own lives. But one of the questions is, how did the males in combat? Have any of you read the wonderful work of Erickson Bass and Maria Stern? They have a wonderful book, a wonderful article on. Maria is very unusual. Well, they are the Marias, but Maria Erickson Bass actually grew up in the Congo and is fluent in Lingala, the main language, one of the primary languages. She has been out interviewing government soldiers about how they explain rape, and how the way in which they talk about that there's acceptable rape and then there's not acceptable rape. They also got some wonderful material on what do they think about women who are in combat, because some of these women they talked to who were combat said that the men were not nearly as good as they were, and said the men are, they run, but we're the killers, and these men, in fact, expressed a great deal of reservation, and this is where you start seeing some of the mechanisms that allow gender hierarchies to exist even when they seem to be being challenged, because what these men wound up saying is that the women who are the killers, the real serious snipers, and that they are just like men. So they are not women. They're put outside what is seen as the normal for women. And when she suggested, well, would you sleep with them? I said, never. So there's a way in which they're being placed outside, and we'll come back to this later on. Women as military officers, there are a few, but again, it's relatively rare. And there's an interesting fact here, is that there are some women in the military, as military officers in the militaries that I've looked at in Latin America and Africa. They have often wound up being still in charge of kind of feminine kind of activities. And they are almost never in the top military brass. It's important to remember that the military leadership in these nationalist movements in particular, and I would say in the post-Cold War struggles as well, that these were the sites where the future leadership, who was going to become the president or the head, power struggles were going on about the future, the post-conflict future, which was all male. It was dominated by a group of senior people who were the male leading officers. And so that is a place where, even though there were some women officers, they were not in that arena, and that's important. They were kept out. In that process, that you get this resistance to gender transformation is also going on in things in terms of sexual violence that you find that officers will, like in the Zimbabwean material, you find that there were officers who used female officers to go and get selected young new recruits, female, to come to their house for a little chat and sex, and so that the women officers were being used as a runner, and so there was a way in which that maintained. And sexual violence and the threat of that against any women who stepped out of line was very common in the military. It was very, very common. So that war as man's business is retained in the dominance of the military officers at the top, being male. And gender-based violence remained as a way of disciplining women that got out of hand, whether they got too ambitious or whether they just got too stroppy. So that the military actually, during war, there is some possibility for change, some opportunity, there certainly are women who get experiences there that open up the possibility of imagining a peace that could include them in different ways than they have lived as women, and could imagine different kind of gender relations in a post-conflict world. But there were, throughout the military, there are also many, many ways in which the military is constantly resisting allowing that imagining to translate into any kind of real possibilities. And what about civilians? And I think this is it's very, very important. We have to recognize that during war, during the conflict, there are some alternative gendered practices that emerge. Women become fighters. Some men wind up doing all kinds of managing work, caring. There is alternative gender practices during conflict. And there's a wonderful article by Dietrich Ortega, which, if any of you are interested in this, you should look at it, because she points out that there's been a tendency among many feminists to say, well, during war, nothing happens really, it's just the same old, same old. But she's saying, that any change that happens is quickly snuffed out, or it's not that important. And she's saying, well, there actually are ways in which during conflict that established gender practices get challenged, get changed, and people even start living different ways than they were raised to expect. So we have to recognize that exists, and that affected the way in which people imagine peace. Some people imagined a very different kind of peace than others, though, because many civilians were caught up in the chaos of war. For instance, in the Zimbabwe struggle, the last year and a half, the army had so many new recruits, both of the nationalist armies. People lost control of them. In most of these struggles, there are periods where there's a difficulty controlling an armed force that tends to be so new and undisciplined, and so you have the chaos of war leading to people being murdered just because you want their property, all kinds of, I mean, in Zimbabwe and many other places, the gruesome stories of what happened in the last year of the war to civilians are in fact still something that no one wants to talk about. And a very fine feminist scholar has done work on that, and she has been basically vilified for doing it. Mm-hmm. And I'm blanking on her name now. But she wrote a whole book revealing the way in which the army, this nationalist heroes, actually were, raping women, killing men for their property, killing anyone they wanted. And so that what happens then is that in the Zimbabwe case, and this happened, I think you can see it happening in Sudan, you can see it happening so many places, the civilians are so tired of war. They are longing for peace. They're imagining peace. But the imagined peace is often one that reasserts a patriarchal order. So that a lot of people are beginning to say, what we need is to go back to the good old days when young men and young women were under the control of senior males, when people knew their place, when we had prosperity. So then, these are the gendered nuts and bolts of the conflict period. Then what happens when you get actually political, you get peace declared, and you get this transition, this post-conflict transformation? What we find over and over is that the political leadership that emerges is almost entirely, it's not entirely male, it's entirely masculine. The women that are in those spots, and there are some, have to play by the rules. The rules are set in a very masculine frame of leadership. And that is very important because they're the ones that have all the power and are redesigning society. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration is not only something that's managed by external players. It's also managed by the internal players, who are the people who are trying to set up a smaller army and to disarm the soldiers and to get back to a peaceful society. And so this is where gender is very interesting. Who is a soldier? Does anyone know how soldiers are defined in the disarmament policies? What do you have to have in order to be a soldier? A weapon. I told you about the women who are cleaning and cooking and everything, and they can grab a weapon now and then if there's a battle, but they don't have a weapon. Anyone who does not have a weapon is defined as not a soldier and is basically just told to go home. Go home, find your people, start your life, good luck. Demobilization, so that's the disarmament, and that is a very gendered. It's much more women than men sent home. Demobilization is then training for the future, but the future involves generally a smaller army because they can't afford this big army, so certain people are being funneled into the armed forces, but most people are being encouraged to go home and to reintegrate into society. And the kind of training that they're getting is the women are learning how to bake or how to do this, clean and cook, and the men are getting leadership training and things like this. So it's the training that's being given to people is very gendered, and it's gendered in an imagined way of a kind of going back to gender relations as we knew it. There are some people with the skills and the opportunities to be able to get around that. And some women do get jobs that they didn't have before the conflict. But the vast majority, the vision within DDR is largely one of reintegrating women into their roles and men into their roles, with a rather traditional notion of the gender division of labor. So returning to the gender normal, which is inevitably in all these societies largely patriarchal, is one of the goals of the whole process. Now there's the creation of national policies for women for women's advancement that do occur during this period, and I'll give you the example of Zimbabwe passed, for instance, a very important bill in '81. The independence in '80, in '81 they passed the age of majority for women, which allowed women at the age of 18 to have legal rights, which they had never had before. And so when you hear that, you think, wow. You think, okay, there's a real commitment. But if you look at the Hansard for the discussions in Parliament about that bill, and it is still being discussed about whether it should or shouldn't be kept. The discussions were framed in what's going to happen if women become, at 18, they become majors, they become legal. They said then they're going to, they may run off, they may, if they're married, they'll kill their husband. There's serious debates about the damage that legally free women, legal rights will bring, that women will basically use them to get control of things. And those debates continue, and it's very interesting. At the same time in '81 there was a law set up, this is African cases, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Nigeria, all set up laws saying that any woman walking alone on the street after 6, or walking just with another woman, any woman who wasn't walking with a man, was arrested as a prostitute and taken, put in jail, and somebody had to come and get her and say, no, this is my wife. And this affected women who were nurses and teachers, women employed, walking, trying to get home to the bus, and were being picked up. Again, demonstrating this unease with the notion of the independent woman. If a woman's with a man, then she's fine. But a woman alone is seems to be seen as a potential danger point. A danger point to the way society should be organized. So there are actually many issues going on. Now, the real aim of this paper is to try and figure out the mechanisms that have enabled even a situation of conflict where some real changes in gendered practices occur, to wind up with societies where the gender normal is very similar, very patriarchal, and very similar to what it was before conflict. And one of the things I've realized is that understanding patriarchal resilience is very important, that the consequences of changing gendered hierarchies actually have material consequences. And this is where my political economist comes out, that we have to remember. When you talk about gender equality just as a concept, it's great. When you talk about it in a way that leads to practices that mean that women might be taking men's jobs, that people who grew up thinking they should have access to the economic and political authority and have competition they're not used to, that this is a very uncomfortable situation. And so when we're talking about patriarchal resilience, we're not talking about just men trying to be bad or be hostile. We're talking about struggles over power. That's what we're talking about. And struggles over power are highly gendered. Masculinist notions of power mean that men are going to be much more able to become powerful than women, especially in terms of economic and political realm. And so so we're not just talking about whether men are being nice or not. We're talking about a struggle over who gets what. So there is a political economy element here which is very, very important. It's also important to understand that alternative gendered practices can make a difference during conflict, but there is a way in which they have been defined in ways that have limited the ability for them to have a long-term future in terms of changing society in any kind of fundamental way. I'm going to give you a series of examples, and this is where I'm, and I love your feedback on this. For instance, the Eritrean conflict. There's wonderful work by Victoria Bernal. A third of the Eritrean army were women. They dressed like men, they looked like men, they were in combat, they were dying. The language that was being used when people talked about women soldiers, they were never called women soldiers or men soldiers. They were only called soldiers. Gendered language was not allowed. Now, what is important about that? What does that make possible?
The erasure of women after.
It erases the changes that are happening during the war in terms of gender. When you're not talking about women soldiers as women and making a difference for women's future. You're talking about soldiers, which means that it's possible that the main discourse around gender relations is outside of talking about the soldiers. The gender discourse in Eritrea continues to be carried on by the people who are not involved in conflict. And so what Bernal points out, which I think is this brilliant couple of articles, is that by erasing gender from discussions of the actual fact of women being in the military, you denuded, you eliminated the possibility that that behavior during conflict could have any implications for a new discussion about gender relations. And indeed, when these young women got back into society, can you imagine how they were viewed? Think about this. You have a young woman who's been off fighting for 5 years. She comes back to her village. They don't know what she's been doing. She's been killing people. She may have been raped. She may have, who knows what she's done. How do you think the parents in the village, her relations even, are going to view her? And this comes up over and over and over. Every single conflict I've looked at, the women returning to their communities are regarded as dangerous outsiders. Who knows what you don't want to let your teenage daughter to go talk to this former soldier, woman soldier, about life. So these young women, over and over, this happens in Mozambique, it happens in Latin America, it happens everywhere. The young women who see themselves initially as the heroines of the struggle, and they go home, and initially they're the heroines, everyone's a hero and everything. And then there's like this thing, and like in Eritrea, she said, they were told, well, you've got to change your hair. You've got to put your hair back. You mustn't wear pants. They had to change all the way they dressed. They at first they were going around real proud with their medals and their uniform and their hair all in this sort of warrior, very threatening kind of way, and they realized that people were treating them as sort of like, stay away, stay away. And so there was this enormous pressure on women, not on the young men. Even like one example in Zimbabwe gives you a very interesting example. A man and a woman who were both fighting for in the war together told their parents that they wanted to get married. Can anyone guess what the parents' reaction was? They were horrified. They said, you can't marry her, she was in the war. Even though they were fighting right alongside each other. Said, no, who knows what she's done? She's damaged goods. So see, there was a lot of this happening. The young women who had gone into war, coming back and finding that they were suddenly under enormous pressure to be what they were supposed to be, what women were supposed to be before the whole conflict started. So that is one of the ways things happen. Another is a very interesting work of Devolo, who's out in Boulder, Colorado, on Nicaragua and Cuba. And she points out that in these two struggles, what happened was that the white male colonialists who were being struggled against, fought against, were castigated as unsuccessful males. They were humiliated and vilified as inadequate, bad soldiers, all kinds of things. So they were labeled as feminine. They were feminized. They were seen as weak, and the people, of course we can beat them because they're like lily-livered, you know, they have no, we are the warriors. We are the true men. And the colonial males are not true men. They are like women. What is the problem of this as a way? This did get past this notion that Fanon was concerned about the way in which colonialism created these men who had no sense of self-esteem or anything. So it was dealing with that. But what about the gender relations? What about gender relations in that? What's happened is one group of men who are formally the powerful are being vilified as feminine. They're being laughed at as feminine, which means the hierarchy that places masculinity as superior and femininity as inferior is retained. And so she points out that, in fact, even though there are struggles going on, and they're around gender, but they don't challenge the established gender hierarchies between masculinity and femininity, which means when the war is over, it's these new cadre of nationalist leaders who become the obvious people to take over. The women are still part of the bottom side of the gender hierarchy. So I think this is a mechanism that's very important to recognize. And then some of what I told you about the way in which the attitude towards female soldiers, I think the more fierce the soldier, the more they're denigrated. And this is another thing that comes up in as another way of reasserting patriarchal power, is just the way in which women who have changed, the more, this is something that Volo and another person, Viterna, noticed, that the more women in the post-conflict period, the women who, what they did, gender bending, I thought this was a nice term, the more women asserted that they had a right to move forward and challenge the establishment, the more resistance against them. And actually it's the women who were less overt and who tried to fit into the existing re-emerging patriarchal structures who got the farthest. And it's the people that actually tried to fight back, the women that tried to fight back, that were the ones that were the most vilified and the most apt to suffer. And in all of this, there was the issue of the temporariness that Enloe talks about, that during the war as a temporary period. Ortega's work is very good on this and saying that this is a way that everything that happened during the war can still be said, well, that was during the war. Now it's peace. Now we have to live properly. So this is why I think all of these mechanisms, and there are probably more that I haven't yet really encountered, but you see that these are subtle but very powerful forces at play that facilitate the return to a peace, a post-conflict transformation that doesn't fit a lot of the hopes and dreams of some of the people who managed to live differently during the war. And the original, the paper as it's written, it winds up being pretty depressing by the end, you know. And I realized that the one thing that I need to add on as a final conclusion is that we still have to understand that any kinds of changes, that just because it's difficult to express your hopes or even actualize them, it doesn't mean that it's not important for people to dream different dreams and hope for a different kind of gendered relations and gendered future. And so I think I need to expand and think more about the way in which strategies for change may come out of some of these experiences, that even though many people the majority are just being ground up in the way society is being restructured, there are people who are organizing, who are making alliances, or drawing on past dreams, and they're imagining new futures, and they're strategizing in a globalizing world. And I think that the paper needs that at the end to realize, and that's where maybe the paper could come back and join with the international and think about the way in which people who've gone through all of these changes may also be many people are out around the world joining the NGOs and the UN and making changes outside their own countries that may have some traction eventually. But so I'm because it is a very pessimistic picture when you look at the hope that transformation could come through war. And the picture that I'm painting is more one of how that doesn't happen rather than it does. But I think that we shouldn't, I'm correcting myself and saying that I need to add to the paper to think that we should realize that many of the struggles, especially feminist struggles for a different kind of gendered world, they go way back into the Middle Ages. I mean, women have been fighting in their own ways, not always successfully, but they have made a difference. And I think we have a lot of changes are beginning to happen, and we shouldn't be in a situation where we think that this is terrible and inevitable. At the same time, I know people who thought that the Eritrean War was going to be, many feminists believe the Eritrean War was never going to be able to go backwards in terms of gender. They looked at 1/3 of the army, this huge number of women soldiers, such a different language about them and the way they were treated. And yet these same people now are I know one woman has given up on Africa, given up. She's so depressed by the story that has happened. But maybe we have to wait another 20, 30, 40 years to watch some small shoots emerging from these experiences of different ways of being gendered and different ways of living, and the possibilities that they may foster change in the future.